Hey guys, this is MTG Degree. My name is Luke, and today we're going to talk about sideboarding in our next episode of How to Think Like a Pro. Now, the first thing that I'd like to mention about sideboarding is that the reason why it's so important is because you play more sideboarded games than any other games, because after game 1, you sideboard, and then game 3, sideboard again. Because of this, sideboarding is extremely important, so we want to make sure that we're doing it as well as possible. Let's go over a quick tip first. And the tip is to memorize your sideboard for 2 reasons. The first one is that if you know that you're going to a game 2 and you've won, sometimes your opponents will say, oh, I'm not going to sideboard, I'm just going to play. And then if you choose to sideboard, then they'll be like, okay, well, I might as well look at my sideboard, it's good for me to do that. But if you have your sideboard memorized, then when you know that you don't have anything, then you can just choose not to sideboard if they don't look like they're going to. And you're kind of encouraging them to do something wrong. And that's just one of the tiny, tiny edges that you can get. The other thing that's fantastic about memorizing your sideboard is what I call doing the full 15. Let me demonstrate this. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate the full 15. It's very simple. All you do is you take your main deck, your sideboard, and you put in your entire sideboard, okay? Then you can shuffle it up a little bit, give it 1 or 2 shuffles. And then you pull out all the cards that you wouldn't have sideboarded in. And you pull out the cards as well that you would have sideboarded out. So you just leave in what you would have sideboarded in. The great thing about this technique is that when you do it, see, look, I know this is in my sideboard. When you do it, then your opponent doesn't know how much you actually sideboarded. This is really fantastic when it comes to decks like Splinter Twin, and they have their Blood Moon in there, and now your opponent doesn't know. Did you really sideboard? Did you put in those Blood Moons? And that sort of thing. So this is a really strong technique to give your opponent absolutely zero information. But you really have to practice it. When you think about it, you say, yeah, I could do that. I know what's in my sideboard. But when you say, oh, I'm going to leave in these 3 of the sideboard and these 3 of the main board are going to come out when I do this, it becomes quite hard. So I actually suggest giving it a little bit of a practice to make sure that you've got it down. So here I put my sideboard in and took the whole thing right back out again. And by the way, this is my blue-black mill deck in Modern, which I enjoy far too much. All right, so now I'd like to go over some of the common mistakes in sideboarding. And the first one is making sideboard choices that are counter to what your main deck is trying to do. So for example, let's say you've got a Collected Company deck in Modern, and when you play it, you say, okay, for my sideboard, I'm going to put some Stony Silences in there to get at affinity. But the problem with that plan is that when you put in those Stony Silences, you're removing creatures from your deck most likely, and making your Collected Companies worse. A better sideboard choice would be Kataki, War's Wage. So keeping in mind what your actual game plan is can help you pick sideboard cards that are more suited to it. All right, another really common mistake is making your opponent's game plan good against you. So let's say that your opponent is playing Jund or something like that, and they've just got a ton of removal. They've got way too much removal, and your deck has no creatures at all. When they're going to their sideboard, they're going to board out some of their removal. But they might have so much removal that they have to leave some in. So boarding in a bunch of creatures at this point is sort of a dangerous move because you're taking those cards that were originally terrible against you and giving them targets. So always think about whether or not you're making their deck better accidentally with your sideboarding. Another very common mistake in sideboarding is to just decide that you don't want to lose to this one deck so much, and your deck is already good against it. So let's say you're playing against Burn, and you're playing Boggles. So you have lots of built-in life gain and whatnot. and you say, I really don't want to lose to Burn, and you put 6 sideboard slots in there, even though Burn is already your favored game. This sort of sideboarding just makes you weak against other decks, and so when you're constructing your sideboard, really think about, what is my deck already good against? Do I really need that much space against it? Just because you have access to a silver bullet, especially in Modern, doesn't mean that it's what you should load into your gun. The next mistake is one that I see constantly in Modern, and that is because of my favorite mill deck. So in this mill deck, I have 4 copies of Mesmeric Orb, which is a fairly powerful mill spell. Really great on turn 2, it'll just mill out tons of cards by the time the game's over. However, when I play this against people, they often bring in artifact removal against me. And this really brings me to my next point, which is sideboarding too much against specifically the card that you died to, not necessarily their entire game plan. So when I play this card, I see people bring in 4 Ancient Grudges and, Shatterstorm and all this crazy stuff, when I've only got 4 of them in my deck. And the point of my deck is not to have this in play, it's to mill you. And so when people bring in all these cards, they're weakening their game plan, and they're not particularly weakening mine. Especially because sometimes I just take these out against decks like Jund that I know that this is a common thing for them to do. So don't overboard against specifically the thing that you died to. Think about what their entire game plan is, and sometimes that will make sideboarding a little bit more clear. The next mistake happens all the time when people are net decking their decks. And net decking is fine, but sometimes what happens is that you copy down that sideboard and you bring it to a tournament, and you don't even really know why that one card is in there. Like you've got an aggressive deck and for some reason there's this Planeswalker or this enchantment and you're like, what is this doing here? And the answer specifically to that is probably that it's there to generate value against control or something. But when you copy these sideboard lists, ask yourself, what is this card for? What matchup does it improve? And if you don't know the answer, and you can't think of when you're ever going to bring it in, maybe don't bring that card, because you're kind of making it into a 14-card sideboard if you don't even know why it's there. Just bring a card that you actually know what it does. Or even better, ask for some help, perhaps on Reddit or many of the deck building sites online, and they can help you figure out what that sideboard card is really for. My next tip is just one that actually could be done in every part of Magic and would just probably make everyone a better player. But it is to actually test your sideboard after you've made it. And the reason why is sometimes you might find that your sideboard is way overkilling this matchup, and you don't need a 90% win rate against that matchup when you've got a bunch of other matchups that you have to worry about. Or perhaps the card that you brought in against such and such a matchup actually isn't sufficiently good, and you need to choose one of the other sideboard cards against that strategy. So always actually test, which can be hard because you have to find somebody that's willing to sit down and really grind it out with you. But testing will always make your sideboard much more refined. Our next one is one that is really hard to not do, which is that when people construct sideboards, they often pick the strongest sideboard hate instead of the most versatile. And sometimes that's correct, but you should always consider both options. So for example, some people will pick Shatterstorm, and they'll say, oh man, if somebody's playing Affinity, I'm just gonna crush them. They will lose immediately. And that does feel pretty awesome. But what if you had a card like Naturalize? Maybe not specifically Naturalize. If a card that can handle artifacts and enchantments, or has some other dual purpose, or something like Ancient Grudge, which even if it's milled can still get an artifact, or you can use it twice. So these kinds of things are really important to consider, and always think about, is the card really strong? Okay, it's really strong. Can it hit more than one matchup? And if it can't, consider how much help you need in that matchup where it's just super powerful. The last tip that I have for sideboarding is a really simple one, which is just don't give in to the tilt. Always, in every format, limited, whatever, if you lose the first game, go ahead and just pull out that sideboard. It might help you out. Even if you feel like you just got crushed, give it a little bit more of a go and pull out that sideboard, because that's exactly what it's there for. It's there to help you out after you have a rough time. So go ahead and just grab it every time and don't give up. All right, well, I hope that this guide has been of some use to you. If it has, go ahead and hit those like and subscribe buttons. You know, it helps me out. This has been MTG Degree, and I'll see you guys next video.